I'm a pretty simple, straightforward guy. I've seen clients for the last 25 years professionally, and I've studied, explored neurolinguistic programming passionately. Had a 5 or 6 year informal mentorship with John Grinder that I got a lot from. I've meditated for about 30 years now, and I've explored hypnosis, various trends or directions in psychology. And I apply this every day with actual live breathing clients and kind of calibrate the results. And that's what I do. And in recent years, I've started to teach something I call the psychological illusion model, which essentially is the notion that most of people's psychological suffering, which includes chronic pain, seems to be rooted in some basic misunderstandings or psychological illusions as to the nature of our experience. And relevant for this, what I've noticed, and I shouldn't say I've noticed because people have noticed this for thousands of years, but that is that we only seem to suffer with thoughts and feelings when they look like a self. Meaning when some thoughts and feelings appear and they seem like me, or I'm fused with it, or it looks like what or who I fundamentally are. And if that's not there, people have a tendency to suffer way less. So I'll give you a quick example of this. And this is something I call one of my asshole moves that I kind of do with clients, to entertain myself. So let's say the client's sitting there in the chair and they're telling their story and they might be crying, they're suffering quite a bit. And I'll look at them and kind of perk up and smile a bit and say, have you noticed that you're suffering quite a bit right now and I'm perfectly fine? And I kind of smile, perk up like this. And this is a kind of assholic thing to do. They usually look at me with that expression of wanting to choke me. And I say to them, look, that comes across as a little bit inconsiderate, but why do you think it is that you're suffering in this very moment and I'm not? And often they might go into their past and things that have happened. And I said, well, but right now, in this moment, why are you suffering? And they usually say, well, I have these thoughts. I'm thinking about the uncertain future, or I have this thought that I'm fundamentally flawed, or that I need people's approval, or whatever it might be. And I look at them and I say, has it occurred to you that I have to kind of have pretty much the same thoughts in an attempt to understand you? Meaning, when I listen to you, I have to kind of try on those clothes or try on those thoughts in an effort to understand you. So I'm sitting here having virtually the same identical thoughts, but I'm not suffering. So it can't really be the thoughts themselves. And this usually gets their attention because they're like, that's a bit different. I say, you know what's the difference really in this moment? It is that when these thoughts appear in my mind at the moment, there's no claiming thought that identifies with them or essentially says that I am this or this is me. They look like your thoughts. But for you, there is that claiming thought. That's really the only difference. And I say to them, there's nothing special about me in that regard. You've had the same experience in your life. You've had the experience of listening to a good friend or family member, and they're really down, they're talking about life, they're having some sort of crisis. And you may be empathetic, you may be compassionate, you may be sympathetic. You kind of have to have many of the same thoughts that person's having in an effort to understand them, but you're not suffering in the same way in that moment. And right then and there, for the person you're talking to, the thoughts they're having look like who they are, or at least theirs. Whereas for you, they look like your friend Jimmy's thoughts. So there's no suffering for you. So this is a very slight, Eastern meditation approaches are to a large extent about helping people discover that there's no such thing as a self, like a permanent, stable, volitional self. And it's usually done in a spiritual context over a long period of time. So what I'm trying to do with this seminar and with clients, the seminar that we're doing in March, and when clients in particular, is that I do my best to create a context where they can discover this for themselves related to the issue that they come in with without having to be a meditator. So that's the work that kind of excites me.
Okay, thank you. And so I guess that's really what I really like about your work is the way that it blends that kind of, some of those Eastern ideas and some of the kind of Western approaches to change work, and actually makes that sort of operationalized and useful with clients. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I can. So back in the 60s, and those of you who are neuroscience fans, will have read about this, but back in the 60s, people like Michael Gosinaga and Robert Sperry and a few other people were doing this operation on epileptics. So for people who had, some people who had really extreme seizures, they came up with this surgery that would kind of sever the corpus callosum, the fibers that kind of connect the right and left hemisphere. And the theory behind this was that by doing that, the seizure wouldn't spread across the brain with the same, intensity. And for a lot of these epileptic patients, this surgery was a, gift of God, a great thing. But something else that was really interesting about it was that the right brain, of course, largely kind of controls the left part of the body, and the left hemisphere kind of controls the right part of the body. And today there's quite a bit of sophisticated science about what the hemispheres do, and it's not as simple as people believed in the 70s, with the theories back then. But what you could suddenly do, so the interesting question was, this person's corpus callosum is severed. What's going to happen to the person, And people seemed remarkably normal. Like they seemed pretty normal. And the really interesting thing is that for the first time, you could kind of communicate with each of the hemispheres in isolation. So what they might do is that they might show an instruction to the right hemisphere that said run, for example, or move. And of course, the left hemisphere had no access to this. And as the person responded to it, they would ask the left hemisphere, why are you moving? And what the right answer should have been the left hemisphere saying, look, I don't really know. I haven't been in touch with the right hemisphere for a while. Like obviously something's been going on over there. But that didn't happen. The left hemisphere, or what Michael Gosinaga refers to as the interpreter, would just make something up. And very often, the stuff that was made up was just completely wrong. Like it had nothing to do with anything. But the left hemisphere, like a slick politician or press secretary, would just make something up on the fly. With the utmost confidence. And some people thought at the time, Roger Sperry got a Nobel Prize in 1981, but a lot of people thought that this would change psychology. This revelation that, wait a minute, this storyteller that we're kind of encountering, that's spinning stories, often has very little access to anything that's going on And this kind of left hemisphere storyteller that very often weaves a story of being the agent behind things, being the initiator, being the one who's responsible, being the one who took credit for whatever goes on, that usually for most of us seems like who we are. Like that's the mistaken identity that most of us go around with. Now, what occurred to me when I read about this is that no, the guys in the 60s who did this surgery should not have changed psychology. Hypnotists should. Of course, any should is shit, right? It's fiction. So I'm saying should in quotations because it didn't happen, so it shouldn't have happened. But hypnotism should have changed psychology because we have the perfect experiments. And let me tell you a little story about this, because when I first got into hypnosis, I was convinced that hypnosis was complete BS. I thought hypnosis was bullshit. At best, role playing, at worst, just a bunch of charlatans. But in the early NLP trainings that I did, hypnosis was kind of included as part of the package. So I went along, and I remember at one of the courses I attended, there was this other guy who also thought hypnosis was bullshit and kind of had a condescending attitude toward the whole thing. And we naturally kind of got along, and we talked about this over lunch, this hypnosis stuff. Well, we'll guess we'll have to attend and this and that. And as part of the course, we did like some classical inductions, testing for various, hypnotic phenomena. And I proved to be not a very good hypnotic subject. And I took pride in that because I thought that means that I'm rational and reasonable and all that sort of stuff. But my friend, the skeptic, he had this moment where they had, first he was given the suggestion that the number 4 didn't exist. So he counted 1, 2, 3, 5, and he ended up with 11 fingers. And I could see that he was stunned. Like plates were spinning in his mind. Like he was sitting there going like, what the fuck is going on? Like this was a real visceral response. And so this guy was clearly a great hypnotic subject. So I was like, something's going on here. And then he was given this suggestion to open the window while receiving a specific cue. I can't quite remember what the cue was. Might have been one guy, doing something with his tie or something like that. And after receiving the cue a few times, my friend went to open the window. And the guy who did the experiment stopped him and said, like, what are you up to? Well, I'm going to open the window. I said, why? And my friend, with utmost confidence and sincerity, on the spot, came up with this very plausible story of why the window had to be opened. And he quarreled, and he got really, really intense about this. And later on, when he kind of received his cue to kind of come out of the experience, he had the wildest belly laugh, like he was crying, tears of like, what on earth was that? And that was the moment that sold me on hypnosis as like, there's a there. Like there's something beyond just compliance or role playing or I remember feeling envious of not being that great hypnotic subject myself, but also feeling a sense of relief that, thank God at least I'm rational and reasonable. And this particular exercise is, I think, the perfect setup to help people see that this inner press secretary that seems like who they are and that kind of takes credit for being the initiator and being the one responsible for the acts is an illusion or an idea of sorts. Because the I, or the I thought that comes online and takes credit for why he has to open the window, is really just an ad hoc entity of sorts. Like it's the drunk uncle who's been sleeping in the back of the car, wakes up at the end of the soccer match, stumbles up onto the trophy place, grabs the trophy and bows, and takes credit for the whole performance. He wasn't even there. Like he had nothing to do with it. And this is what meditation and also kind of neuroscience is pointing towards, is that I thought that shows up as a kind of ad hoc entity and takes credit, and that we automatically seem to identify with as us, really has nothing to do with it. It's just a sideshow. So this particular hypnotic experiment, if you do it with a client or if you do it with a group, is a great, of course, most people, I think, don't quite have the hypnotic capacity to experience it in a way that's compelling. But for those who do, I'll tell you two stories to kind of end this little loop. I worked with a woman a few years ago who came in and reported that she had a lot of anxiety, and she had this voice in her head that she called the dictator, which was on her case all the time, badgering her, commanding her, get things right. And it looked to her as if that voice essentially was in charge and was needed for motivation and for her not to screw things up. And during the session, we both went into this, call it the field together, where everything just slowed down profoundly. And at the end of the session, she was just serene. She left the office, got into the car to drive home, like a 1-hour trip. And the first thing she noticed was that her tinnitus was gone. Now, I had no idea that she even had tinnitus. It was nothing that we had worked on specifically. And then she noticed that the dictator was gone. Like, it just wasn't there. And as a first response, it kind of scared her. And the first thought was, how am I going to get home? Like, how am I going to drive the car without the dictator telling me what to do? And she made the remarkable discovery that she knew very well how to drive her car home. And the dictator, or that kind of self-referential thinking, was gone for a week and a half completely, like just blown out. Of course, she had some practical thoughts, but none of the rumination or the kind of past fixating type stuff. And she discovered to her shock that, her kids didn't starve. She performed well at work. She was on time for her meetings. Like nothing at all was lacking in her life. And then after a week and a half, this inner voice and some of the tinnitus started coming back. But she told me that, that week and a half has completely changed my experience of myself and of life forever, because I realized that I was fully functional without that voice in the head. Like it didn't initiate or really do anything. And what we came up with as an analogy was, like, let's say a naive person came here with a time machine from some other time and watched the Olympics and watched the gymnasts doing their floor routine. And you listen to the sports commentator. You could easily get the idea that the sports commentator is really running the show. Like, it is kind of making the gymnasts do their thing and is kind of responsible for what's going on. And could easily seem that way because there seems to be some correlation between what the sports commentators are saying and what's happening on the floor. But the truth is, if there was some technical glitch and there was silence from the sports commentator booth, the gymnasts would still do their stuff. It's just a sideshow. Now, what I discovered, because I was kind of cocky for, I think, 3 years with at least I'm sane, right? And then I went to a seminar in London. I can't quite remember what type of seminar it was, but a seminar in London, and this is 20 years ago. And I stayed at this hotel, and I went to this nice Indian place to get some food by myself one night. And you know, I tipped them well, and it was nice food, and people were nice. And I came back to the hotel, and I had this strange feeling when I came into my room that something was missing, something was gone. And I looked at myself in the mirror, and I saw that my leather jacket wasn't there. And instantly my mind flashed, because I remembered giving the jacket to the waiter at the restaurant, or not the waiter, but being shown where to put the jacket. So I was like, shit, when do they close? So I ran out into the, you know, not too sunny London streets just in time to catch the restaurant. And I asked for my jacket, and they were like, no, there's no jacket here. You know, you didn't have a jacket. And of course, I completely remembered having a jacket. So after a while, I started kind of quarreling with them, and this idea that someone had stolen my jacket, and they were kind of ripping me off. And I asked to talk to the manager, and I had this prediction. They're going to say that the manager is on vacation. And that's also exactly what happened. So after a while, I left kind of huffing and puffing, you know, gave them a lecture on ethics, you know, and I walked down the street, you know, like unhappy and grumpy. And this whole movie in the mind of these unethical, sleazy assholes who had stolen my leather jacket, and how dare they, and, you know, all that sort of stuff, came back to the hotel. I walked past the bar. I caught the eye of the bartender, and he looked at me and goes, ah, he took up my jacket and said, you forgot this earlier. And I was like, fuck, Jesus Christ. And all I'd had was a Diet Coke. It was not even any alcohol, you know, in the, but I realized in that moment that I'm just as nuts as the highly hypnotizable folks. It's the exact same phenomena. And cognitive psychology kind of shows this, that we think that we have experiences first, and then we kind of reason and use our intelligence, but it seems to be largely the opposite, that the brain is a belief engine. We often start by believing, and then we use our reasoning skills to, kind of like a lawyer, build a case that kind of supports what we already believe. And as soon as my mind filled in the blanks of what happened with that leather jacket, that inner lawyer generated a story, and there was this complete identification moment to moment with this character. And of course, the moment the bartender kind of rescued me, the spell was over. But I had a humbling experience of realizing that this is the human condition, and B, I was damn lucky to have a bartender this time. What about all the other contexts in my life where I don't have a bartender? And I've been a complete idiot, but I have no way of knowing it, because I'm the last one to kind of see the blind spot. So having a way to be able to see through that constant identification can be extremely liberating.
Brilliant. I love that story. Yeah, and I suppose that brings us on to the next point, really, which is your way of working really does blend some of these Eastern things and also the Western approaches. And I just wonder if you could say a bit about how you work in that respect, and also, what are the best bits of each approach? What do they lack, or what bits do you take that give you?
Yeah, so I think, I have one foot solidly in the meditation world and one foot solidly in the kind of other world. So I think what the Eastern approaches really get right is what I just mentioned, because we don't really have experiential ways, or we haven't had too much up until now to kind of deal with that. But the Western approaches, the effects of suggestion, the importance of context, social psychology factors, the reconstructive nature of memory, these sorts of factors are so important. And so for example, in the meditation world, there's a lot of talk about pure this and pure that, pure knowing, pure direct experience. And of course, we kind of know from our vantage point that there is no such thing. So hypnosis based again, there's this researcher called David Spiegel who did the famous believing is seeing experiment at Stanford, where they took high hypnotizables and low hypnotizables and kind of suggested that they hallucinate color onto some object that was in black and white. And when they gave the suggestion to the highly hypnotizable ones, they reported seeing colors. And through the fMRI scans, you could see that the color processing areas in the visual cortex of both hemispheres lit up in the exact same way that they do when people construct colors. That did not happen for the low hypnotizables, who were, in quotation marks, just imagining it. But it shows very clearly that a suggestion can deeply influence the kind of pre-verbal, unconscious, pre-conscious, if you will, processes that kind of massage and tweak information before you have a first access of it. And given that this is going on all the time through contextual factors and priming and suggestions and all sorts of stuff, it's really clear to me that a lot of what people call discoveries, pure discoveries in the meditation world, might not be so pure. My a couple of favorite examples of this, and the first one is not from the meditation world, but it's from Virginia Satir. John Grinder used to tell this story about watching Virginia Satir work. And she was working with a family, and there was this angry father. And Virginia did a beautiful job of pacing him. You work hard, you sacrifice for the family, you put food on the table, you don't feel appreciated, blah, 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 blah. And you could kind of see the father this was a perfect yes set, to kind of really matching his experience, and he was nodding in on board. And then Virginia stopped and she looked at him, intently with expectancy, and kind of lowered her voice and said, "And now that you've so honestly and beautifully expressed the anger, would you be willing to talk about the hurt that lies behind the anger?" And to everyone except Virginia's surprise, the father started bawling, like with tears, and he completely broke down. And most people would probably interpret that as solid evidence that meant that there was a lot of hurt behind the anger. And could be, but it could also completely not be the case. And very few people would kind of acknowledge the contextual factors and Virginia's role and the yes set and the suggestion and the expectancies. And Grinder had this great point where he said, look, if you're automatically going to grant that there must have been some repressed hurt behind the anger, well, when someone quacks like a chicken or whatever in a hypnosis show, you would have to accept the idea that there's some repressed urge to do that just was so I attended a meditation seminar in New York back in 2008. Was this guy called Genpo Roshi, who had this process that he called the big mind process, where he kind of promised that people could have the sorts of enlightenment awakenings that the spiritual masters cultivated over decades, that people could have it, over a weekend. It sounded kind of American, in a sense, but I was curious. I'd read his book, and I was on vacation at the hotel by coincidence. So me and my wife and a good friend, we went to the seminar, and it was a Friday afternoon, Saturday and Sunday. And Genpo Roshi had this guy who clearly had an NLP background as a kind of co-presenter. And he spent so much of the first night and the second day kind of laying the frames, presenting a kind of psychological theory of all these sub-personalities that we have. We have an inner controller, an inner child, and this and that, and all these stories and all these suggestions. And then during the next day and a half, so many people had these experiences of contacting the inner controller and the inner child and the higher power and all these sorts of things. And it felt so involuntary, like it just spoke, it just happened. And so many people were ecstatic over this. And pretty much everyone seemed to interpret it as, I just made a discovery, and it was a pure discovery. And I didn't want to ruin things for people, so I didn't do the bull in the china shop thing. But I asked all the people I could see with the most shiny eyes, and I kind of asked them, what's your experience and what do you make of it? And all of them, without exception, claimed it to be a pure discovery and that it meant all these various things. And none of them seemed to have any inkling of wait a minute, could this be at least partially a co-construction or suggestion based in that particular context, meaning you have the alleged enlightened meditation master, you have the persuasion expert on stage, you have that whole context, you have all the stories, all the expectancies. People had essentially been told what to discover before they discovered it. And that sense of something feeling involuntary was then used as evidence that it absolutely had to be so. And I've seen this quite a bit in meditation communities and speaking with meditators over the years who don't have that hypnosis background and who might not have studied any Western psychology, that they're often very naive to those factors. So if you can combine it, there's a lot of really useful stuff to be had there, even though I have to say, there's a lot of people in the hypnosis world who will take any involuntary type of response as absolute evidence of and I've seen this in the Grinder kind of new code. A lot of the students have ended up with this idea, I was in doubt about these and these things, but then I asked my unconscious, and it spoke, and it was verified by this involuntary signal. And that means that, and it seemed like a secular form of prayer, essentially, and getting some involuntary response and then attributing it as absolute evidence that God or some being had just spoken the one and only absolute truth.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess, blending that is really important. And when you're working with people in the style of work that you do, can you just describe what that actually looks like? Because you're kind of getting people to have those insights for themselves and to see through those kind of illusions.
Yeah, most of my clients are not long-term meditators or most of them are, regular folks. And they're not going to be long-term meditators either. They're not necessarily on a spiritual path, even though some people might be. So it's more about how can they have a glimpse of this in a way that's relevant to their particular issue. So with the seminar that we're doing, March 19th and 20th, the whole No Self, No Problem seminar, we're going to cover the first day is going to be a lot of like just exploration, and then some very practical applications. Because if you look at, for example, let's take claustrophobia, for example. If you work with a claustrophobia client, they're not interested in the nature of the self, but they're interested in flying without freaking out, or they'll so often say something like, I'm stuck in the plane for an hour, or when I'm stuck in the tunnel or in the elevator, I have to get out. And the fact that I can't get out when I want to, that freaks me out. So helping someone have an experience of, it's not that they are in the elevator, but the perception that they label elevator is actually appearing in them. Helping someone do that in an artistic way can very often pull the rug from it, or helping someone, for example, become the plane. Because we're not talking about like third person objective reality in a sense. We're if there is such a thing, but we're talking about a kind of first person. What if I can become the plane and really have that be my felt experience? Well, that's not congruous with the experience of being trapped. Now, the experience of being trapped is a perception. Or if you take social anxiety, people very often say, to really struggle with it, there's often this sense that there's someone out there judging me in here. So I'm in here behind the eyes, and there's a world out there that's separate from me, and someone out there is judging me in here. Now, this is a perception. It's just a perception. It's not reality with a capital R. So helping someone have the discovery that they're not actually in here. That's just a perceptual trick. Can very often then give them a very different perception on meeting new people. So all you've done is you've changed the perception by helping them see that this stable thing like self that's being judged is not who they are, but it's really just an idea that comes and goes.
That's really useful. That does relate to something that a question that was sent in was just your clients. What sort of things do you work with? Because obviously the psychological problems, you might argue they're all psychological problems, but also I know you work with allergies and other physiological things as well. And it's interesting that that having those realizations can change those things.
And it's, the whole no self, no problem is kind of a catchy, it's a, but it's like when I work with people, I say, fundamentally, all I ever do is help people relate to their experience in a different way and relate to thoughts and feelings in a different way. But I see clients for, the anxieties and phobias and panic attacks and people who depress and people with jealousy issues, anger issues, compulsions, addictions, chronic pain, a lot of psychosomatic type issues. But so much of it, if you really drill down, is like an identity level thing. I am this particular person, or this implicates something about me. And most people aren't used to exploring in that direction. So most of the time, people are used to exploring their story or the content of their thinking, or their history, or creating different states, but what's the nature of this alleged self that all these thoughts and feelings seem to imply or refer to? That's an orientation that's common in non-duality circles and meditation circles, but it's not very common in a psychotherapy practice, or for an NLP coach, and I'm arguing that it can be damned useful. But I have to say, I don't always work that way with all clients all of the time. Not all people like it. Not all people are a good fit for it. I'm pretty frame flexible, if you will. So sometimes my work will derive around breath work, or more hypnotic approaches, or behavioral tasking, or teaching them particular skills, or just being a good sparring partner. So it's not I'm not selling an end all be all. I'm not saying that this is the thing to do with all clients all the time, because that's not true. But for quite a few people, quite a bit of the time, it's a pretty good match, and it offers a different frame, a different way of working with perceptions and identity that it's not that common.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that. Do you want to say a little bit about what people, if they are interested in coming on the workshop, will be doing there and learning?
Yeah. Well, the first day, we're going to just be doing a lot of experiments, mostly. So some experiments with a partner, some experiments alongside the group, some sorts of demos, but it'll be mostly experiments designed to help people to realize some of this stuff for themselves, because people so often go, how do I use this with my client? But that's worthless until you've kind of seen some of it for yourself. And then during the second day, we're gonna go more into like practical applications. So for example, how I might help someone this way with like things like claustrophobia and social anxiety and shame, hatred, these sorts of things. So it's going to be an interesting blend of just experiments, demos, meditations. And for people who have done the psychological illusion model course, there's going to be material here that they haven't seen before. So experiments and ways of working that they won't be familiar with. So it's obviously based on the same sort of model, but there's going to be different stuff than I have been teaching in the traditional PIM courses. So there's something for those too.
Okay, excellent. And just to clarify, you don't need to have studied that before. You can come to this fresh, so it's kind of open to anyone.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can help people overcome any background. It depends on what you want to do. I think anyone who wants to see clients for a living should have a background in it and study it seriously, but you can come for self-application. And sometimes people who don't have a background in these things pick it up easier than the people who do, because they often have so many theories and so many filters. And is it like this, and is it like mindfulness, and is it like, oh yeah, Eckhart Tolle, he says this, and the rest, the less of that people have going in, the easier it usually is to have some insights and to have some realizations and to see something new, or to see it more deeply. These things are not an either or type thing. It's a matter of glimpsing it, seeing it again and again, seeing it more. So for me, I see it more deeply now than I did a year ago. And hopefully in 5 years, we'll see it more deeply and be able to apply it with clients that I'm not reaching at the moment, for example, or a slightly different angle. So, for anyone who wants to get their toes wet and want to dive into it, and if this resonates or makes sense, as in, yeah, why not look in that direction? Why not combine some of the East and the West and see? It's an intro. It's an introduction. It's hopefully it will open people's minds up to exploring in a different direction than they're used to. If we can do that, I'll be a happy camper.
Yeah, well, workshops up to now have been really good, and brilliant feedback on them. And I think what's really good about this is, as you say, attendees get their own insights, because they need to kind of go through that for themselves, as well as then being able to think, well, yeah, this is how I can actually use this with another person in a setting like that. Yeah. It's a double whammy, really.
There's something else too when doing these things, and it is useful if you embark on that journey to do so with people who have some experience with the terrain. So I have some experience with this terrain. I've meditated this is my 30th year. So it's because there are some pitfalls and traps that people can go into that can be quite uncomfortable. And it's useful to be in touch with someone or be in touch with people who also explore. And I think this is something, for anyone who's done psychedelics, for example. I haven't done a lot of psychedelics. I've had a few experiences. But one thing that's become very obvious to me by those experiences is that clearly there's a lot of room for interpretation of what those experiences mean, if anything. So it's the same here too, that having good solid frames, being able to contextualize it well, being helped to make sense of it in a way that's useful is really important. Because I've seen people who have made the discovery that free will is a myth, and it's been life-changing for them. Like it's been truly liberating. But I've also seen people make the exact same discovery and they've plunged into a deep depression. So it's not necessarily these sorts of realizations. Of course, there's always an interpretation of what things mean, and there are some typical traps that we can get into. So I want to talk a little bit about that too, in the seminar, because it's usually often not mentioned. Quite a few people have this idea that, oh yeah, if people can only discover that or notice that or develop that, that's great. And it's like, yeah, for a lot of people, but you can also interpret it in a way that really makes your existence miserable. And I suspect, even though I can't be sure because I'm not in anyone's mind, but like, for example, with psychedelics, I suspect that some people who have had, whoa, that changed my life. And other people who were like, you know what, that truly screwed up my life for 3 years. That was horrible. The experiences or the perceptual shifts themselves may not have been that different, but the interpretations of what it meant and the implications, and that might have been extremely different.
Yeah, completely fascinating.
So even that with meditation, you know, these days meditation is often presented as the end all be all for everything from balding heads to flat feet, you know, and everything in between. And there's a lot of evidence that meditation is good and can do a lot of good things, but it's a double-edged sword. It's not for all people at all times necessarily a good thing. It's the same thing goes with everything we do. Like for some people can have catastrophic outcomes.
Okay, so I mean the value is that you'll be showing people how to kind of troubleshoot those things and avoid those pitfalls with this work.
Yeah, and also as a responsible teacher, kind of saying, look, we have a forum, you know, I am available to know that you have, for the participant to know that, okay, there's someone to ask and explore with, or a group of people to ask and explore with, I think is very important for these types of topics.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I'm really looking.
It's a bit like the whole, you know, no free will thing. You know, where for some people, having a realization like that can be amazing, and for other people, it can be deeply depressing and not at all empowering. So again, a perceptual shift in of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything mandatory, but you can make sense of it in ways that are, you know, more or less useful.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? It's kind of how you make sense of things. Okay, well, yeah, we're coming to the end now, and we've had a couple of questions, but you've actually answered them as you've gone through.
Those are just my psychic powers, Pete. You know,
obviously, yeah. So people ask about how you blend this and the format of the workshop. So we've kind of covered everything, and you know, it's completely fascinating, and I love that kind of blend of the different things, and you know, drawing on those insights. And of course, because you know, it's that when the client or yourself has those insights, that's when it's the most powerful. You know, it's not an intellectual thing, is it? It's
a bit like it's a bit like the old Bruce Lee spirit, you know, who, you know, my background is in martial arts. I'm a lifelong martial artist, and you know, he had this wonderful mindset of like, you know, take what is useful for you and kind of discard the rest. You know, test, troubleshoot. Today we have the mixed martial arts, right? Where a lot of the people who step into the octagon, for example, or the ring and compete in mixed martial arts, they know some striking, you know, they know some grappling, they know some submissions. Traditionally these days, they'll have some training in Thai boxing, they'll have some Western boxing, they'll have wrestling, they'll have Brazilian jiu-jitsu skills, and the change work arena, you know, should be the same way. You know, no one has all the answers. There's no instructor or lineage or organization, you know, that has all the answers for all people at all times. So I want to emphasize that too. You know, that the way I work is not for everyone. You know, me as a teacher is not for everyone. These particular Yeah, really good ending points.
Okay, we won't end it on you're not for everyone, but you'll be for lots of people. So brilliant. Thank you, Jorgen. That's been absolutely fascinating as always to speak with you. And yeah, well, I'll thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found that useful.
Shall we give them the dates and the
Yeah, I'll drop you an email to say thank you anyway with everything on there. But yeah, the date, it's 19th and 20th of March, and we're running from 10 till 4 each day, so that's a Saturday and Sunday. But I will send all those details in an email to each and every single person, just in case you're interested, and it would be lovely to see you there. And yes, it will be recorded. That's a question just popped in. But get there, and we'll have an insightful, exciting couple of days.
hope to see you guys.
All right, take care then. Thank you, everyone.
All right.